All right, I think we have a good amount of people here now, and so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on turning disruption into opportunity. We're excited to have you all here. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes I want to bring forward. First, feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen here to ask any questions to us during the presentation. Dan will kind of collect those and we'll address them towards the end. And second, the webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sharing the recording with everybody afterwards. And if anyone didn't attend, they'll be able to have access to it as well. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dan to introduce today's topic and speakers.
Thanks, Gagan. Hi, everyone, and thank you for taking time to connect with us today for our Turning Disruption into Opportunity webinar. My name is Daniel Mohammed, and I'm the Director of Client Engagement for Tracker Networks, and I'll be moderating this webinar. With us today is Jason Doel, Tracker Networks co-founder, COO, and CRO, who will lead the webinar. Just a little bit of background on Tracker Networks. We specialize in enterprise software that helps automate strategy, risk, and sustainability. We are proudly a 100% Canadian company that serves clients in 55 countries across 20 sectors. During our client onboarding and support, we've seen best practices that we are happy to share with you today. As Gagan said, the webinar will be approximately 30 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A portion. So please add your questions to the Q&A area during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion. And after this, we will be sharing a copy via email. With that, I'll hand it over to Jason.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Gagan, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. You know, as we meet, we're meeting in an interesting time, to say the least. We're facing uncertainty or levels of uncertainty about economics and geopolitics that most of us have probably never seen in our lifetime. And you know, while a lot of the focus has been on tariffs, what really appears to be happening is a broader disruption of the principle of globalization and the rule-based order that's been in place for the last 80 years. Virtually all sectors are affected. No one is spared from these changes. So this is putting immense pressure on boards and leadership teams to try to figure out how to respond and to position their organizations for a new future that's coming at us quickly. Now, fortunately, the principles and best practices of strategy and enterprise risk management can help us as we work to do this, especially when we recognize that disruption and change also create new opportunities. And so from that perspective, we're going to cover 4 topics today, including stress testing and adapting strategy, identifying where change and risks present opportunities, using continuous insights to make our companies agile and more future-oriented, and identifying weaknesses in our supply chain. And as part of that, we're going to use our own Essentials platform to show some practical examples. Now, before we jump right into that, we think it's important to address some misconceptions about risk management and to establish some concepts that we're going to build on when we go through our examples. The first misconception is about how we define risk. And, you know, if you look in a dictionary, you'll see a definition for risk that describes risk as a danger or a potential loss or a threat. It's a common perception of risk, and it's why most people have a negative reaction to the term risk. We think there's a better definition in a business context, and that's to think of risk management as a way of managing uncertainty and how uncertain events might impact our objectives. You know, with strategy, we've got outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and there's always going to be events or risks that might happen and that would impact our ability to do so. And so if we can proactively anticipate and manage those risks, then we're more likely to achieve our objectives. And really the key ideas then that come out of this are that, you know, risk is a fact of life. You know, if you're trying to achieve anything, then you're going to be facing risks. Risk always involves an element of uncertainty, and risk management can be thought of as a tool to help, you know, achieve positive outcomes while dealing with that uncertainty. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to establish. The second misconception is this idea that risk comes from doing things, you know, like launching a new product or doing big projects. When in reality, you know, the greatest risk can come from not doing things, you know, like accepting the status quo and not taking action when we should. And I think it's really important we talk about this now, because this status quo risk is greatest in times of change and disruption like we're currently experiencing. It often comes from failing to recognize that the assumptions we've been working under aren't valid anymore. It can also come from mistaking inaction for prudent caution. It can feel comforting and sensible to take a wait and see approach, but we have to be careful we're not missing our small window of opportunity when we can take action, to prevent impacts or to capitalize on these changes that are occurring. What it really often comes down to then is being able to distinguish between hard and soft trends. And hard trends being inevitable events that are based on measurable facts versus events that might happen and are open to influence. And so, to be fair, it's not easy to make this distinction right now with everything that's going on, but we can help ourselves in a practical way by being mindful of status quo risks and having an active practice to look for them and to address them. It's one of the ways we can compensate. The third misconception is that when we talk about times of disruption and change, we can end up focusing too much on this idea of resilience. Now, resilience is a good thing, and having an agile strategy and enterprise risk management practice can really help, to have a reactive agility in our organization. But there's a danger if we only think in terms of reacting. We need to also understand that times of disruption present opportunities, and risks can be opportunities if we understand what the risks are telling us, and then if we take action on that. Author and futurist Daniel Burrus talks about developing an anticipatory mindset. This means cultivating a culture that embraces, anticipation. He also talks about building a future view, which he describes as a shared and informed vision of the future. So, in an anticipatory culture, instead of avoiding risk, we're thinking about what the risk is telling us and how we can leverage it. We're using this future view that we've built and data to distinguish between soft and hard trends. And then instead of waiting and seeing, we're taking action to, proactively shape the outcome that we want. And this connects to another mindset shift that we need to make. And the idea, is that in strategy, you're in this continuous cycle of ambition and planning, executing, and then reflecting to make adjustments and corrections. Now, what's critical in times of disruption and change is that the cycle's turning fast enough. If you're only looking at your strategy as part of annual budgeting, or your ERM program is looking at a spreadsheet once a year, it's just not fast enough, and you're not going to be able to meet this challenge. Strategy and enterprise risk need to be continuous cycles that are fed by data and then distributed throughout the organization. Now, fortunately, it's not as hard to do that as it might seem, and we'll show you some examples when we go further. So now with all of these concepts in mind, let's talk about stress testing our strategy. Now, whenever we're thinking about strategy, a key best practice is to lay out the logic, of how we think we're going to achieve our strategy. So for each of our key objectives, we're thinking about the inputs or investments we need to make, the initiatives we're doing and the outputs we're going to produce, and then the outcomes that we expect or hope to see in the short, medium, and long term. And underpinning all of this are the assumptions that we're making and the external factors that we're counting on or that could impact us. Now, taken all together, this is called a logic model, or some people call it the theory of change. It's our logic or theory of how we're going to create an outcome or affect a change. And so, hopefully you can start to see now how in times of great change, we need to revisit our assumptions and decide whether or not our logic still holds. And, at an even higher level, we have to ask ourselves if we're pursuing the right objectives in the first place, or has the playing field changed so much that we need to find new ways to win? Now let's add back in the connection with risk. Remember, we talked about risks as being events that might happen and would impact our ability to achieve our objectives. And there's some best practices from enterprise risk management that can really help us to test our logic models in a more structured way. One of them is a risk bow tie. It's a diagram or a structure that helps us to do scenario planning around risks. Moving from left to right, we've got threats or conditions that can cause the risks to occur. And we have pre-event controls or mitigations that we can use to try to prevent that from happening. But once the risk event does occur, shown here in the middle, we have post-event mitigations or controls that we can use to try to lessen the ultimate impacts on our objectives. So to put it all together, when we stress test, we're reconsidering, our assumptions and external factors in our logic models, along with the likelihood that related risks will occur. or are there new risks that might impact our objectives? And then we can do modeling or scenario planning on how the risk impacts would affect our expected outcomes and what we can do about that to try to manage that. And the final piece to bring all this together is to include metrics like performance metrics and key risk indicators so that we can be more data-driven in our analysis. And we're doing all of this with our opportunity mindset and our future view, where we're thinking about how we can leverage changes and how we can take action to shape the outcomes that we want. Okay, so now just to summarize all this quickly before we move on into some of the examples, we've redefined risk management as a practice to help achieve our objectives and stress test our strategy. We need to actively seek out and identify status quo risks, and we need to shift our mindset to see risk and change as potential opportunities. A key to doing this is to have an anticipatory mindset and a shared future view within our organization. Tools like logic models and bow tie diagrams can help us to do this in a more structured way. And finally, we need to make it data-driven and operationalized by leveraging metrics, making it a continuous process, and rolling it out throughout our organization. Okay. So with all of that as background, I'm going to switch now over to our system and bring it up, and we'll go through some examples, and we'll also touch on supply chain because we haven't mentioned that yet. So we'll come back to that.